Hello, this presentation was made for a joint paper written by myself, Reem, and my colleague Lakshmi titled Bordering Processes, the Evolution of Social Borders in the Time of Pandemic. I'm sure you are familiar with these images. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought with it the need for physical distancing in order to prevent disease spread. This has reshaped the way we occupy space, drawing an invisible border of physical distancing between us. As individuals, societies, and nations, we have changed the conditions of entry into our physical spaces. Our space has become introverted, restricting the entry of people who once were welcomed into our physical borders. We have created new physical borders and redefined the existing one. Thus, we have created a kind of physical and spatial rebordering. Due to the sudden nature of this spatial rebordering, various needs that were previously met by spatial interactions remained unfulfilled. This has promoted an attempt to replicate the functions of these physical spaces through virtual platforms, a kind of debordering. This has forced a greater permeability to virtual spaces of interactions and loosened virtual borders. Education and both formal and informal gatherings, such as conferences, meetings, weddings, family visits, and even religious ceremonies, are now being performed through virtual mediums. We have chosen Bahrain and India, our countries of origins, as our context. The reason for this are global mainstreams narratives still focused on pandemic spreads and responses in the global north. Choosing contexts from the global south was an attempt at decolonizing the narrative in a small way. Although India is the second globally on the active cases, it hasn't been globally discussed to the same extent with regard to its pandemic response. The contrasting sizes and scales of spread in the countries offer an opportunity to understand the similarities and differences in various scenarios discussed in this paper. Due to the limitation of deadlines and for practical purposes, the scope of this paper have been limited to the periods between March and September this year. We have adopted a qualitative approach to analyze this paper. We begin by observing a number of articles that spoke about a state of change in the borders in order to contain and prevent the spread of the virus. The articles sourced from newspaper were limited to what was found using the search algorithm, relying on the official newspaper and Ministry of Health in Bahrain and the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in India may have set the tone of voice of what has been represented in this research. Another method employed in this paper and commonly used in correlation research is observation in practice. The fields of observation for this study are the borders between public physical spaces such as streets or schools, private intimate physical spaces such as homes, and virtual spaces. The observations on these three fields are based on the discourses generated from the data collected. This was then analyzed through visual mapping. The interpretation of the data obtained was done through the lens of the Thomas Nail's theory of the border. Two additions to a part of theory have been proposed, and this hybrid theory has been used as a framework for analysis. The visual mapping cross-referenced the physically impacted spaces such as restaurants, schools, and health institutions with their corresponding emergent virtual counterparts. Therefore, both physical rebordering and virtual debordering processes were mapped. The similarities between India and Bahrain are illustrated in gray. With the use of visual mapping, we could flag unique dissimilarities and then interpret it and understand the possibilities. For example, in Bahrain, there was a prominent use of television to bridge the gap in e-learning processes. The similarities offer potential to examine their impact on the second or two different contexts. While some virtual spaces weren't exactly the same, the food and grocery delivery app, both in India and Bahrain, were very similar in nature and function. Now over to my colleague Lakshmi.
Hello, my name is Lakshmi and I will take over from this point in the presentation. So, in Theory of Border, Thomas Neal outlines three core concepts of social motion or kinopolitics: flow, junctions, and circulation, where flow refers to the movement of people. The junction is the point of decision. This is the point that determines whether a flow can be expelled or recirculated within the border. One common example of a junction could be the gates of an apartment complex, where the decision is made of whether an individual can be allowed in or out. Dissecting junctions and their execution. As we were interested in understanding exclusion in our study, we focused predominantly on junctions as these are the decision making points. So, further to Thomas Nail's explanation of junctions, through this analysis, we propose two core concepts of these junctions: border conditions and border mechanisms. Border conditions are the parameters that dictate circulation, that is, how the junctions expel and redirect flows. The border conditions also determine who passes through the border and who is sent back in. Therefore, they dictate the permeability of the border. Border mechanisms are the technologies or mechanisms used in or by these junctions to execute these border conditions, that is, to maintain and reinforce these borders. Border mechanisms determine the extent to which the border conditions are enforced. So in this slide, you see the map we had generated as a template in order to understand the stakeholders, the beneficiaries, and those excluded in and by these bordering processes, both in the spatial rebordering processes and the virtual debordering processes. Through this mapping, we've tried to examine the following: nature of the junctions and their execution. So, what were the nature of the junctions in the spatial rebordering processes? What were the conditions of these junctions? And what were the mechanisms through which these borders were reinforced? Who created these mechanisms and who dictated these conditions? Driving forces. So, who instrumented these bordering processes and what were their driving forces and what were their key motivators? And the consequences, especially exclusion. Who did these borders exclude and what was the nature of the exclusion? And what is the interrelationship between the nature of the exclusion and the people excluded and these mechanisms and border conditions? Are they in any way related? And if so, how? So, moving on to our first instance, where we've analyzed, which we've analyzed through the lens of border theory. In this first case study, we shall examine how border mechanisms caused exclusion. In India, despite a deep depression in demand for food delivery apps, so this was caused both by people's safety concerns and some state governmental curfews which prevented food delivery. The two major food delivery apps in India, Swiggy and Zomato, stayed afloat financially through reinventing their corporate structure and experimenting with delivery models like delivering essential services and essential goods and groceries and not just food. They also had a significant downsizing and fired many of their employees in order to maintain capital gain. In this map, we see that those most affected by this process were the delivery personnel, with the delivery personnel is because they risk losing their jobs and also were at most risk of pandemic spread due to the nature of their employment. Also, they had to navigate spatial rebordering process that had begun to occur due to the nationwide lockdown. The junctions in these rebordering processes relied on the mechanism of strict policing by the government. Many of the delivery persons who remained employed suffered violence in the hands of police forces who mistook them for people who were trying to flout the curfew during the initial stages of the lockdown 1.0, which happened in late March and early April. Therefore, the intersection of the border mechanism employed by employed through police surveillance and the vested interest of maintaining capital gains through a virtual debordering process. So, at the intersection of these, the delivery personnel were excluded, and they were affected and excluded by two separate bordering mechanisms. So, for the second instance, we shall examine how the rigidity of border conditions impacted exclusion. The imposition of the first lockdown in India was sudden and was implemented within 24 hours of announcement. The border conditions prevented any non essential movement across interstate borders. The rigidity of the border conditions meant that the migrant workers returned to their cities of employment but without their jobs. The government's mechanisms for handling this return and recirculation weren't robust either. This resulted in many migrant workers taking to traveling hundreds of kilometers by foot, which led to many cases of death by exhaustion. While discussing Bahrain, due to similar instances of recirculation, but with respect to countries' border, low-wage migrant workers suffered living conditions in the workers' camps, which denied them the basic safe separation distance to keep them safe from the pandemic. Despite being economically underprivileged, the Bahraini government's promise to cover the nation's wages did not apply to migrant workers from other countries. Therefore, the rigidity of the border conditions in both countries caused a recirculation. However, government aid wasn't appropriately planned to handle this recirculation. This caused exclusions of migrant workers who were among the most financially underprivileged. Therefore, an important understanding generated from this instance is that in such spatial rebordering processes, it is important to include border conditions that permit and facilitate movement of migrant workers across the state or country borders in a safe and timely manner. In the next instance, in the field of education, in both countries, virtual debordering occurred through switching to online modes of learning. In India, most of the norms for operating online were dictated by individual educational institutions. However, due to this being initiated by individual institutions, it benefited only those who could afford to have devices to access the internet. It also benefited, of course, the edtech and the video conferencing companies themselves. Those without access to technology, who comprised of more than 70% of the nation's population, were left with few or no means of access to education. In Bahrain, the Ministry of Education addressed the issue of lack of devices in homes by collaborating with the Ministry of Information Affairs to create lessons which were broadcasted through television. This ensured that students weren't missing their classes because of the lack of devices. Some telecommunication companies, as part of their social responsibility, tried to provide more reliable connections throughout the day by increasing speed and providing unlimited data usage for educational and collaborative platforms such as Teams, Google Classrooms, or even Blackboard. Though driven by capitalistic interests, this debordering attempted to provide temporary relief to families with multiple learners. We would like to conclude our study with some lessons that we have learned. Number one is that mapping the excluded stakeholders of different bordering systems could provide foresight to understand potential intersectional exclusions, as seen in the first instance. Instance 2 highlights the need to plan the permeability of the border according to potential consequences of recirculation caused by rigid border conditions. Instance 3 highlights that virtual debordering wasn't actually a true removal of the border as much as an increase in permeability of the border, but only to those who could afford infrastructure to cross that border. There are lessons for Bahrain and India to be learned from each other. As evidenced in instance 1, both countries could benefit from government ensuring that there are certain policies in place to protect the financially vulnerable. Instance 3 illuminates the need to take steps to make the internet an essential commodity. Examining existing and proposed policies for pandemic preparedness through the lens of border theory can help us to understand or foresee the impact of these policies on various sections of the society. Therefore, this method of analysis could be employed to create robust policies that are more inclusive and address the needs of members of the society. The paper also acts as a reference point to reflect on the research question. To what extent will the debordering and rebordering continue after the pandemic? Could this be a turning point or a new course further? Thank you.